the Chinese dream without a peaceful international environment.
In Washington, Ling Chen is a professor of international political economy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She specializes in comparative politics and political economy of China and East Asia. In Beijing, Victor Gao Chukai is chairman of the China Energy Security Institute, an interpreter for China's former paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping. Mr. Gao is a recognized expert on Chinese culture, society, and international relations. Back in Washington, Haiyan Wang is managing partner of the China-India Institute and the author of several books. She is a frequent contributor on China and India to the international media. Welcome, everyone. President Xi Jinping has been in the United Nations, various activities, speeches, many promises about what China is doing. Is this a significant increase in China's engagement with the world? Ling Chen.
Yes, I do see this as signaling to both the international communities and to home that that China is increasing its engagement to the global South, the global North, and in general international affairs.
Yeah, and what is the reason that this is happening now, do you think?
I think that it is only natural that as China enhances economic power and broadly geopolitical and on every front is engagement, that China's role will become more prominent. And as a global power, China will and is expected to play a responsible role as a partner. I think that while China's engagement is intensifying or more prominently visible, but the founding principles, I think, stays the same. That is that China, from the very beginning, is committed to the UN ideals of multilateralism, that China is committed to multipolarity, that China pursues peaceful rights, peaceful development. All of these is consistent throughout that China's engagement with the global affairs.
Victor, from your perspective of having watched China's leaders for several decades, how can you characterize President Xi Jinping's new approach to international affairs?
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, this is the first time for President Xi Jinping of China to visit the United Nations headquarters and to make not only just one speech, but several speeches at the United Nations General Assembly, at the United Nations Sustainable Development Summit, etc. So for him, this is a big event for his visit to the United Nations. Secondly, in terms of substance, I think President Xi Jinping also emphasized that China wants to support the United Nations and view the United Nations as the center of the global leadership, and all countries in the world need to coordinate their own efforts with the United Nations, and with the blessing of the United Nations, international initiatives will become politically correct. So major powers in particular should operate within the framework of the United Nations rather than outside of the United Nations. All these, I think, will not only be important for the visit to the United Nations itself, but will have lasting implications for years or even decades to come.
Do you see any difference between China's leadership today and previous generations in terms of emphasis, in terms of the specificity of commitment?
Definitely, I see a lot of differences. First of all, President Xi Jinping has brought his own personal style to the major initiatives at the United Nations. His wife, Madam Peng Liyuan, also made important contribution as a special envoy of the United Nations on AIDS and several other major initiatives. So it becomes more personal. And in China in particular, if the top leader is personally caring about a major agenda, then the government agencies, the society in China at large, used to rally behind it. So that makes it very, very personal for President Xi Jinping and Madam Peng Liyuan. Secondly, I would say the circumstances that China is faced with now compared with under Mao Zedong or under Deng Xiaoping or under President Jiang Zemin or the former President Hu Jintao have been completely changed. Now in President Xi Jinping's term, China is getting closer and closer to the real center of the global stage, and how to define China's role, how to be perceived not as a challenger of the international order, but very much as a promoter of the current international order and a beneficiary of the international engagement within the United Nations framework. All these messages need to be hammered out, and I think President Xi Jinping is really taking a personal initiative and making a personal push to make China's strategic intentions and its newly defined international role more transparent and more easily understood at the global stage. This is really President Xi Jinping's major initiative.
How do you see the reaction of the world community, both developed nations, U.S., European nations, and frankly India, that you know well, in terms of China's rather sudden emergence on the world stage, as Victor said, coming to the center perhaps sooner than many people expected?
I think that China's emergence on the global stage is not that sudden, but gradual. Over the last 30 years, China has been the growth engine to the global economy, and everybody is watching China's rise, some with envious eyes, some with suspicions, and some applaud China's rise. And I think majority of the leaders and the people across developed countries and developing countries welcome China's peaceful rise and see China's development is a contribution to global growth. China's engagement in global affairs promotes the Millennium Development Goals, that China's financial support, personnel support, and working through the UN on various missions, whether it's peacekeeping, whether it's alleviation of poverty, whether it's disaster relief, whether it's building infrastructure, promoting South-South cooperation, and et cetera, all as positive. On the other hand, we do have politicians, mostly in many developed countries, that look at China with suspicion, and they still doubt what they hear. So when they hear that China respects the global order, that China promotes win-win cooperation, they tend to look at a few contentious issues and zero in on some of the issues and suspect that China wants to project its own power more assertively, and some even say more aggressively, regionally. But I would say that the majority welcome the messages that President Xi delivered.
You are watching Closer to China. We'll be back after this.
I think that China has made a big splash here at this summit and General Assembly. And this is wonderful news for developing countries because countries are impatient. They want to get on, but sometimes the funds to get on are not there.
If you look at the overall pattern of the Chinese technical cooperation in the last 20-30 years, the investment from China to many of the developing countries, as I said, whether it is in infrastructure, development of agriculture, development of ports, the railways and road, there has been a very substantial contribution from China.
Chinese government is actually one of the first governments that responded to that call, and I'm very grateful to that. And of course, Chinese government have sent more than 1,000 experts to different countries. They build hospitals, and they also provide laboratory support as well as financial and material support.
China is now the largest trading nation in the world, with strong ties to Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. As the largest developing country, China is both contributing to and benefiting from South-South cooperation.
On September 20th, Ethiopia inaugurated a modern rail project that has been constructed by the China Railway Group in the capital of the East African country. With 2 lines and a total length of 34 kilometers, the electrified Addis Ababa light rail transit is the first light railway on the African continent.
This is a very historical moment for the country. At the same time, this is a very historical moment for the transport sector in this country. So we are very happy, we are delighted. The history is in the making process, so we are very happy.
China's projects and investments in developing countries in recent decades has become a paradigm of South-South cooperation. It goes back as early as the 1950s, when China provided financial assistance to the Egyptian government to fight British and French invaders. As China becomes a powerhouse in the global economy, it is playing a crucial role in advancing South-South cooperation by combining the country's vast economic potential with its commitment to the global economy.
Looking to the future, China will continue to take a right approach to justice and interest by putting justice before interest and joining the other countries in a concerted efforts to realize the post-2015 development agenda. To this end, I wish to announce the following. China will establish an assistance fund for South-South cooperation with an initial pledge of $2 billion in support of the developing countries' implementation of the post-2015 development agenda. China will continue to increase investment in the least developed countries, aiming to increase its total to $12 billion by 2030. China will exempt the debt of the outstanding intergovernmental interest-free loans due by the end of 2015 owed by the relevant least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing countries.
China is making substantial economic investments all over the world. In many developing countries, such as Africa, China is by far the largest investor. Is this a game changer in China's international diplomacy?
Indeed, China is in uncharted waters, and we'll see how we will sail. Ling, is it just the question, as Victor said, in terms of China's perception, or are there real issues as China engages with the world and how they interact? There's the charge of neo-colonialism, of what China does in Africa, a charge that China is going to be exporting its excess capacity of polluting industries. I mean, there are substantive kinds of issues and challenges that China's going to have to face, no?
Yeah, I think so, because as China increases engagement with other developing countries, China will have to face some of the different political, cultural, and religious systems, and not so in the process that China reaches economically to these countries, it will have to also deal with these different systems behind. I think for China, that is a challenge for China itself. And for other countries' perceptions, I think, yeah, Victoria is right that there is highly likely that other countries would likely perceive it as building another economic empire, basically. So I want to say that what worries me most is how to get this message conveyed to other countries both effectively and accurately.
And how do you see what China does in terms of its specific activities that could backfire against it? What should China be worried about as it engages in this clearly wonderful humanitarian effort to help the poorest countries of the world? But as everyone knows, there are sometimes unintended consequences of things that you do.
Definitely. I think that we need to look at China's engagement through several lenses. The first lens is through the economic lens, which we are talking about trade. China's trade has brought prosperity to some countries, but we must recognize the fact that a lot of developing countries are also worried about, as you said, China's excess production capacities. On the investment front of the engagement, overall, it is very positive. China's $112 billion ODI, outbound investment, to developed countries and to developing countries really create jobs, create manufacturing plants, create infrastructure, it is a huge plus. Now, China's engagement on the geopolitical front is a little bit complex. And I think that if we just if we are not keeping our ears to the ground, not hear what the other countries are complaining about, that is a little bit naive. And I think China is still on the early stage or learning to build alliance.
Victor, what worries you about China's new engagement with the world? You talked about China being able to tell its own story better. I'll give you that, yes. But in terms of the substance, as China reaches out with these kinds of programs for underdeveloped countries, for poorly developed countries, what are the things that China needs to be concerned about? What lessons could it learn from what the Western powers did in the older style of colonialism? Can China learn some lessons from that?
Definitely, there is a long list of all these issues, but on the very top of this list is actually the fact that the United States may or may not have come to terms with the prospect of China becoming bigger or even much bigger than the United States as an economy. Let me emphasize that China has no desire or intention to export its political system. China does not have a religion to export. China does not have very much of a political agenda to impose on any other country in the world. Therefore, China is very much engaged in economic relations, trade relations, and dealing with all the countries, regardless of their size or economic weighting, for example, on an equal basis.
This is a question I want you to think about. We'll deal with it next section. This is Closer to China. We'll be back after this.
We were very pleased to hear of the contributions that China has announced, notably to peacekeeping, to the help help peacekeepers in Africa through the African Union, and its very generous donation to the Peace Building and Development Fund.
I think as far as Nigeria is concerned, what the Chinese president said, he meant it. We are already benefiting from it as a country.
We are really very grateful to the People's Republic of China. They are indeed making a number of projects in my country, and very important ones. The largest, for example, is the rehabilitation of Juba Airport.
So his message was that of equality of all nations, small or big. And I think that was a very powerful message for smaller countries. You can remember the clapping, the standing ovation that he got from developing countries.
With its rapid development, China is ready to contribute more to global affairs, including playing a leading role in UN affairs.
Major Tao Hong is the head nurse of a Chinese medical team deployed to Mali. Born into a military family, her work here is second nature. Married for 24 years, she leaves behind a husband and a son in China.
The first thing I will do when I return home is to cook properly for my husband, because I used to just finish the task, not do it with heart. This time I will cook as a wife and a mother.
Like Tao Hong, more and more Chinese soldiers are essential participants in UN peacekeeping operations. Since 1948, the United Nations has launched 71 peacekeeping operations. Today, 16 of them are underway across 20 countries. More than 100 countries contribute uniformed personnel to UN peacekeeping operations. In terms of troop numbers, China ranks in the top 10.
I also wish to announce that China will join the new UN Peacekeeping Capability Readiness System and has thus decided to take the lead in setting up a permanent peacekeeping police squad and build up a peacekeeping standby force of 8,000 troops. I also wish to announce that China will provide a total of $100 million of free military assistance to the African Union in the next 5 years to support the establishment of the African Standby Force and the African capacity for immediate response to crisis.
Chinese peacekeepers are widely recognized as a reliable part of the UN force. With its increasing economic capacity, China seeks to shoulder more responsibilities in global governance. This includes contributions to anti-terrorism and the fight against climate change.
Welcome back. We're dealing with an issue that China has never faced before and may have to face in the future, which is what happens when Chinese assets and, more importantly, human beings are adversely affected in countries in which they are invested or working. As we know, China has its very important Belt and Road Initiative, which involves some 60 countries, many of whom have different religious and political systems, and many of which are unstable. And if instability occurs, Chinese assets may be affected. China has never before faced this. How is it going to deal with it?
Well, as a matter of fact, similar events have already happened in China's globalization, which is intensifying as we speak. Normally, what China will do includes several things. One is to respect that particular country and deal with the legitimate government in that country, and does not involve in interfering in the domestic affairs of that country. This principle, sometimes other countries think this principle is controversial, but I think it works well for China now. If any hijacking or hostage issues happen, or properties being negatively impacted upon, for example, then the Chinese government need to deal with the legitimate government in that particular country, or sometimes also mobilize other resources to talk to those behind these tragic incidents. Now, whether this strategy will continue to work when China is more and more globalized and when China is more and more involved in the Belt and Road Initiative, in transferring its manufacturing capacities to many parts of the world, this remains to be seen. But I would say that China needs to work with the relevant governments and avoid doing anything unilateral, for example, and also avoid using any military means to resolve these issues. This will remain very much desirable on the part of China. Whether changing circumstances will eventually force China to rethink its strategy and take other options, I do not know. I hope that will not happen for China.
I think that the scenarios you describe is not a hypothesis. It's very much the reality. We have seen it happening in the past. We will see it more happening in the future because China invests in high-risk territories. For example, China's highest expenditure in terms of engagement, in terms of engineering construction projects, are in countries of Nigeria, in Pakistan, in Venezuela, and a lot more, say, West African countries, where there's a great amount of instability. I think that precisely because of that, and China is not standing aside, it's not passive. China is actually actively participating. When you look at the fight against Muslim extremists in the Middle East, the fighting against ISIS, when you look at the denuclearization of Iran or denuclearization efforts in the Korean Peninsula, so these are the efforts, and China are not saying, okay, we leave the old powers to deal with it, and new rising power will just stand aside and benefit from it. China is actively engaging in it. But on some principles, China acts slightly differently. That is, China has always adopted the principles of non-interference, non-invasion by force into another territory. I think that on that front, China perhaps does slightly differently. But overall, we see more global cooperation in dealing with these instability forces, whichever corner it comes from.
This is Closer to China. We'll be back after this. President Xi Jinping's personal participation at the United Nations makes the case that China takes seriously its increasing responsibilities in a complex and imbalanced world. China reaffirms its commitment to work with the UN and other international bodies for world peace, prosperity, stability, and sustainability. President Xi announced that China will establish a fund for sustainable development in low-income countries, epitomizing China's vision of South-South cooperation. starting with $2 billion and increasing to $12 billion by 2030. He also stated that China will exempt the debt of the least developed countries due by the end of 2015, and he pledged about $3 billion to help poorer countries combat climate change. But it's not only about money. It's also about best practices, optimizing projects, controlling conflicts, and managing risks. In addition, President Xi hosted with the UN a World Summit on Women's Rights. With dozens of presidents and prime ministers in attendance, President Xi helped put human rights, women's rights, high on the global agenda. Right now, on planet Earth, the real conflict is not between opposing political or economic systems, but rather between, on the one hand, the energizing forces of modernity, competence, and development, and on the other hand, the repressive forces of ignorance, exploitation, and oppression. That's the deep reason that China is actively reaching out to the world. We monitor it all on Closer to China.